Sometimes when you're creating a chart, as we have here with the page views and the shares, the chart doesn't quite look right, and it would be quite useful if you could map one set of the numbers on a different scale. Let me show you what I mean. So we're taking our web stats data. It has each of the months of a year with the number of views for that month and the number of shares for that month. I don't need to highlight anything, and we're going to use our quick keyboard shortcut. Don't forget F11. Gives me a column chart, and I can see the blue bars are my page views, and then the tiny little orange bars are my shares. Let's just change this chart type to a line chart, and the distinction between the two lines is now even more engrossed. Because the shares are all in the hundred thousands, the scale has to work with those hundreds of thousands. Therefore, the share values end up down the bottom here, and you can't see much variance between the months, because compared to the hundreds of thousands of page views, there isn't much variance. However, if I were able to take this particular series by clicking on it, right-clicking and format the data series, that pops up the Format Data Series box on the right, and I can move this series from the primary axis, which is where everything gets graphed, to a secondary axis. Then I can see how the pattern of the shares now works. The scale for the shares is on this right-hand side now. So you can see we've got a second y-axis effectively, showing different values because the values within the shares are obviously of a smaller scale. They're in the tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. But what it does allow you to do graphically is compare much closer the pattern between the page views and the shares. Now each of these scales are totally adjustable yourself. So I could click on that scale, come to the axis options and change the minimum and the maximum boundaries. Currently they've defaulted to 0 and 60,000. Well, I don't have any shares up at the 60,000. So let's drop that down to 50. And really to make this match up, I ought to change the scale on the left hand side as well. So instead of being 700,000, let's make that 500,000. Quite enough. I think 600 might be too much, so we can experiment. 600,000. That brings it in line. So by adjusting the scales of my two axes, I effectively can compare two values that need to be compared. So the page views do need to be compared against the shares, but they don't match together very well because of the disparity in the actual volume of the numbers, with the page views being in the hundreds of thousands and the shares being in the tens of thousands. So if you ever happen to find yourself with two series that need comparing, so they need to be in the same chart, but there's such a disparity in the volume of the numbers, then you can use this option of a secondary axis. So one way of doing that is how we did it. We created the chart with our quick F11. We went in, we selected the data series, and we said plot on a secondary axis. Now there is another way of doing this without having to create the chart and then effectively change the axis. What we can do is click into our data, go to Insert, and choose Recommended Charts. Now there's a number of recommended charts in there you could stick with, but let's go with All Charts and come down to this Combo option right at the bottom. Here we can change, as well as change the fact that the page views and the shares are different graph types. We could make them the same. Here is the option for a secondary axis, so I could take my shares and plot them on a secondary axis. That's through the recommended option, so I don't need to create the chart and then go and change the data series. I can do it through the recommended, choose All Charts, come down to Combo, and as well as this ability to change between one of the values going on the secondary axis, I can actually plot them differently. My page views could be a column, whereas my shares could then be a line. And that might be a way of easily comparing things. And when I click OK, I get a floating chart that represents that information. This is where your two series are needing to be compared, but are so far apart from each other in values that a secondary axis becomes really very useful way of comparing the items graphically.